Happy Monday, CPAC Live family. It's Ian B. Walters filling in for our fearless leader, Matt Schlapp, who will rejoin the CPAC Live anchor desk on Wednesday when he has a chance to sit down with Iowa Senator Joni Ernst and Pennsylvania Congressman Scott Perry. But for the time being, you're stuck with me, Ian B. Walters, your loyal Sherpa, and we're going to jump right into the important issues of today with our friend, ACU board member, former Trump Deputy National Security Advisor, and the author of the great book, Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People, our friend, my friend, KT McFarland. How are you on this warm Monday?
I'm not down there in Washington in the swamp, so I'm doing pretty well, Ian. I don't know.
I hope you have a cool breeze.
Not where I am.
Excellent. I'm so pleased to hear it. We've had a lot of things happening on the foreign security front in the past 2 weeks that I know you're going to help all of us get smarter on. Last week, we saw a couple consulates from China get shut down here in the United States. There were reports of burning documents inside the courtyard inside the Chinese consulate in Houston. There was an incidence of a UC Davis, University of California Davis researcher who had lied about her involvement with the Chinese military that was being held in the San Francisco Chinese consulate. In retaliation, the Chinese closed down the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. This is all beginning to have a very Cold War 1980s espionage feel. KT, are we moving toward, or are we in the throes of a Cold War with the Chinese Communist Party currently?
Yeah, I think that we are, if not in it, we're certainly headed towards it. And the Chinese have been conducting a Cold War against us really for 20 years. It's just that we're finally noticing, we're finally waking up. And I think it took President Trump and his understanding of what was really happening in the world and his ability and willingness to just stand tall to join the issue. You know, Republicans and Democrats alike for the last 20 years have pretended it was all fine, and it wasn't all fine. I mean, we were underwriting China's economic development at the expense of our own economic development. We were underwriting it because the theory was that, well, if China becomes prosperous and gets a middle class, then they will be an open society and an open economy, and they'll be good trading partners with us, just like the Japanese have been, just like the Koreans, just like the Germans, the British, the French, because we underwrote their economies at the end of World War II. The difference is China doesn't play by those rules. And what President Trump, as a candidate, and the reason I supported him from the very beginning, was he knew it. He saw what was happening in international trade. He saw how the Chinese were stealing intellectual property. And he understood that the Chinese were kind of moving out, not only diplomatically, but militarily, to supplant the United States, to replace us as the dominant world power. And so what you've seen in the last couple of weeks is the outward and visible sign of that.
I think we've all come to grips with in the early 2000s, granting them entrance to the WTO, the most favored nation trading status, that those were grave mistakes. How is President Trump untying that knot that we got ourselves into, as you said, 20 years ago, with the shift of jobs over there to China? As you said, he recognized exactly the profound negative impacts that was going to have on our economy. How's he going about untying that, unpacking that, and reversing those trends?
Well, I think it has been two steps. At the beginning of the Trump administration, he tried to engage with China. We tried to negotiate. I mean, he knew he wanted to renegotiate the unfair trade agreements, and he knew that he wanted to stand up to China and the South China Sea particularly, which is the world's most important maritime trade route, that the Chinese are trying to pretend is all theirs, and really they're going to decide who gets to come and go. So President Trump at the beginning of the administration sought an engagement. And we had a trade war with China, which I think we won. And we had phase one of the trade agreement. And everything was going fine until the pandemic hit. And I think that the way the Chinese have responded, not only with the pandemic and unleashing it on the world, the lockdown situation, the way they've exploited the economic and health situation in the world, and the way they're treating Hong Kong and potentially even Taiwan, I think that was a real wake-up call for everybody. And President Trump, from that point on, said, okay, we've tried playing fair with you guys. We tried playing fair for 20 years. You took advantage of it. We tried at the beginning of the Trump administration to negotiate with you to reestablish some kind of reciprocity, and you haven't lived up to it. In fact, you've exploited that situation too. So now the United States is going to take certain actions in concert with our allies to really force a change in the global situation from where it was going. I mean, my conclusion is that the Chinese had all along prepared and really planned and plotted to replace us as the dominant world power by mid-century. That they would push us out of the South China Sea as a maritime trading partner, push us out of the Pacific, that they would exploit our economic situation, steal intellectual property, prevent us from investing in their country, buying American companies, and then taking the technology and using them themselves. That those were all part of a plan. And the plan was to dominate the world by mid-century, and then they rewrite the rules of order of the world to suit themselves. But the pandemic has speeded up that timeline. And so what you've seen are the Chinese have a plan to have a maritime trade route that they dominate. That's the South China Sea. They have a land route that they plan to dominate world trade, particularly between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. That's the One Belt Initiative. They have a 5G infrastructure development program where they want to really build the infrastructure of the future. And then they control the future. Then they control all communications as we move into the Internet of Things. That's with their Huawei 5G network. And then they've moved out diplomatically to try to squash the whole idea of a free exchange of ideas in the international community, especially the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization, to really suit their own. So President Trump in the last month, and this is worth noting because the media won't ever cover it, in the past month there have been 4 key speeches that were made. One was made by the FBI director, Ray, and he talked about intellectual property theft and spying, how the Chinese are spying on the world, but particularly America. Number 2, the Attorney General gave a speech, and he talked about Chinese economic exploitation. You know, who knew this about the Attorney General? But it turns out his undergraduate and graduate degrees were in Chinese. So in addition to being the Attorney General and a lawyer, he's really a pretty renowned China scholar as well. There was another speech made by the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, who I helped bring into the Trump administration. And he talked about wolf diplomacy. This is China going around the world using their economic clout and really blackmailing and exploiting other countries to do their bidding. And then the whole thing was topped off last week by a speech at the Nixon Library by Secretary of State Pompeo, which said, here's what we're doing about it. We've now identified what the issues are with the 3 previous speeches, and here's what we're doing about it going forward. We're bringing our supply chains home. We're not going to be dependent on China for health equipment or technology, anything else. Number 2, we are going to work with our allies, the democracies, free market countries in the world, all of whom have been exploited by the Chinese and all of whom have seen what the Chinese are really up to with the pandemic and what's happened since. And we're going to work with them to build really a trade alliance, between a trade and economic alliance with all the free market democracies of the world. And then finally, we're going to push for new technology. We are the innovators, but we've let our investment in technology really slip. And so we are going to push for more innovation, more technology, and we're going to protect it and we're going to defend it. So those are the things that we're doing. We're standing up to China. We're going to stand with our allies because we're much more powerful together than we are alone. And we are going to maintain the technological lead that we have always enjoyed. And we are not going to let the Chinese steal it, buy it, borrow it, beg, or receive it from us. And I think that's the future. Now, if you want to call that a Cold War, maybe it's an understanding that the Chinese have been at Cold War with us, and we're finally waking up to it and taking steps to defend ourselves.
When Matt Schlapp and Schneider re-envisioned CPAC back in 2015, and you had a real role in helping us re-envision that, along with Gordon Chang, and how we were going to address China and educate the American public, conservatives especially, on the trouble that we were facing. This was 5 years ago when nobody was talking about China, when we were still stuck in 2002 kind of thinking. We listened to John Batchelor's show, and you talk about the South China Sea. They were building islands out of thin air in the middle of the South China Sea. We say, well, what is this about? Is this a military expansion in international waters? They say, well, we'll make these islands available to the global community should they need to use them. It was their excuse. You talk, but help me explain this to our CPAC listeners about you used the word blackmail. How the Chinese economic forces will go into someone else's country, get construction contracts, bring in their workers, create shoddy buildings at another country's expense. How does that racket work? Because I really think that this is an emerging thing that the American public need to recognize. There's a certain amount of debt that is the U.S. debt that's held by the Chinese that we're all becoming increasingly concerned with. What's the Chinese thinking? Help us explain that to our fellow Americans, that blackmail racket.
All right, so what the Chinese have done is they've, as you point out, there were islands in the South China Sea. Now remember, all the trade that goes from Europe, from the Middle East, from Africa, goes through the South China Sea on its way to China, Japan, the Philippines, Korea. And this is a major sea lane of commerce that the world has always respected, as any nation can sail through it, any nation can trade. Now the Chinese have claimed that as an internal Chinese lake. You know, it doesn't mean much until they start doing the things that you've talked about. So what they did about 8 years ago is they took these rocks, they were really piles of rocks in the middle of the South China Sea. And they said, well, we're going to make these into fishing ports because, you know, we have fishermen in the area.
It's just fishing. We're just fishing.
Yeah, we're gonna help our fishermen, and you know, if other countries have bad experiences with fishermen, you know, if the Philippines says we'll help their fishermen too. We'll never militarize those islands. But what did they do? They immediately militarized them. Their airstrips, their naval bases. There was military, their army, their soldiers on them, their Marines out there. Anyway, the Chinese have now claimed those. And then they said, well, as long as we're here, we're just going to claim all the water between us and mainland China as ours. You want to sail through it? You want to fly over it? You got to get our permission. That's number one. Number two, they've gone to 70 countries from Europe to the Middle East to South Asia, Southeast Asia, China. And they've said, let's have a Eurasian trade route, not dissimilar to the Roman Empire, and we will help you. I mean, you're backward countries, you can't afford it, we've got a lot of money. We'll help you build ports, we'll help you build roads. We're going to build the infrastructure, and we have a lot of Chinese workers who've just been building all these new cities in China. We'll use Chinese workers to do it, and we'll lend you the money so that you will, at the end of this, you will have a port that you own, you'll have a superhighway, and Chinese will build it, and you'll own it, and just think of the trading opportunities that will happen to you. Well, what happens when somebody gets overextended on their loan? The Chinese seize the collateral, and that's what they've started doing. In Pakistan, other countries, they've built these great ports, and then when the country cannot, and the Chinese knew they could not meet the payments, the Chinese said, okay, well, we'll seize the collateral. And so that's what they're doing in these 70 countries, an attempt to control world trade. And the third part of it is that the 5G network, the Chinese are trying to build the infrastructure of the internet of the future. Now, we all think, oh, great, 5G, we're going to all download Netflix movies so much quicker than we did before. The Chinese are thinking, no, we're going to build the internet of the future, and we'll listen into everything anybody's doing at all times in all places. So the Chinese have gone to countries and said, let us build your internet infrastructure. The Huawei, the company they use, we'll build the internet structure for you of the future. They go to Mexico, we'll do it at a cut rate bargain price. They've gone to the Europeans saying, we're going to do it for just peanuts, much cheaper than the Swiss or the Americans or anybody's going to build it for you. And so countries say, well, this sounds really good. We need the internet of the future. Let's go for it. But what the Chinese then intend to do is that when they have that ability, they listen in on everything and they can control. Now, the reason they can do that is because in 2017, the Chinese passed a law that nobody paid any attention to. But the law says that all Chinese individuals, Chinese citizens, Chinese companies have to give whatever the government asks them. So let's say the Chinese military comes to a company in Houston, for example, and says, you're in Houston, you're in the aerospace industry, we want you to spy and steal information and download stuff and break into networks of the aerospace industry that's in Texas. Or they go to a student who's at Stanford and they say, well, you know, you're near Silicon Valley. You're there for your graduate degree. We want you to get in the network of the people who are developing some kind of new technology on the internet. The Chinese, no matter what a company or individual says, they have to do it or they go to jail. So the Chinese are now planning to use the internet of the future to do exactly that. So they will control what people, they're going to look at, they're kind of looking over your shoulder. Every email, every conversation will all be looked at by the Chinese to use as they will. So all those things together, internet of the future, trade, maritime trade route, land-based trade route, all of these things together are how the Chinese plan to dominate. And that's why what President Trump has done is so important. And then the Chinese have used the pandemic to go around the world exploiting. So they knew, Ian, and this is just criminal. The Chinese knew that the virus that was in Wuhan, they knew it was the potential of a worldwide pandemic. Whether it happened in a live market with bats or whether it happened in a lab, who cares? The fact is the Chinese understood it was a problem and they shut down travel within China. So they locked down Wuhan. You couldn't go from Beijing to Wuhan or from Wuhan to Shanghai, but you could go from Wuhan to Milan. You could go from Wuhan to Seattle. And so for 3 weeks, they told the world, don't worry about it, nothing, no problem here. And they were sending that weapon, that bioweapon abroad. And they used that period of time while they were reassuring the world there was no problem before people started becoming infected. And they scooped up and bought up all of the testing equipment, all of the pharmaceuticals, all of the personal protective equipment, all that stuff. They just scooped it up so that they would control who got it. And then when the Europeans said, yikes, we've got a real problem here, where there's a pandemic. And they would say, who caused it? And if the Chinese went to them and they said, if you criticize us, you're not going to get testing equipment. You're not going to get PPE. They came to President Trump and they said, if you complain about us, if you say we're at fault here, we're not going to give you pharmaceuticals. You're not going to get acetaminophen. You're not going to get penicillin next year. So they went around the world blackmailing countries to not criticize them. So that's why, if you'll notice, a few months ago, all of a sudden everybody's saying, oh, the Chinese are doing this so well. The Chinese are doing this so well. It's because they were being blackmailed.
One of the difficult things for me to stomach sometimes is that if you're Xi Jinping, if you are an authoritarian dictator, it's a whole lot easier to control your citizenry, shall we say, than if you live in a free democracy where dissent is tolerated, where you're allowed to speak your mind. One of the things that's on my mind is that very recently there have been a number of declassified documents that have come out related to the origins of the Russia probe. This is what happens in a free society. We get all of this information thanks to FISA acts. You were, of course, unfairly treated as a part of that, and we can put the clip to your CPAC speech where you tell that very powerful story of what happened to you. What's your sense of what we can learn from these texts and emails that have been declassified? It seems like it's more and more evidence that this entire Russia collusion accusation was fraudulent from the beginning. It's obviously not getting picked up by a lot of the mainstream media. They continue to wish for it to be real, when in fact it's clear that it's not real. What's the recent information that's come out that may move some people in a certain direction on this topic?
For 3 years, Ian, the mainstream media, the anti-Trump liberal media, and the Washington bureaucrats and the Washington establishment, it was all Russia, Russia, Russia. Donald Trump is a Russian agent. He would not have gotten elected without the help of Vladimir Putin. And they all knew it was a fraud. They knew it was a total fake. I mean, they had evidence early on that there was nothing to it, but they kept perpetuating. But and one of the ways they did it was to have anonymous sources that would leak to the Washington Post or the New York Times or to CNN. And they would, in a flurry, say, well, there's more evidence there. See, these anonymous sources have evidence of how bad everything is. Now it turns out, with the investigation of the investigators, which the Attorney General and John Durham, who's a Connecticut attorney, state's attorney, that he's been asked to look into the investigators. What were they really up to? And now what's being released is not anonymous sources or innuendo or gossip or whispers. It is cold, hard documents. It turns out all these guys who were abusing power, who were lying about the Russia hoax, they were claiming there was an issue and there wasn't, they all kept notes. They kept emails. They texted each other. They either were so confident that Hillary Clinton was going to win and this would never see the light of day, or they were thinking, well, I need my own insurance policies. If this ever came out, I'd be in big trouble. I must make sure that I could have the ability to blame the guy ahead of me, the guy next up on the food chain. But it turns out they have copious notes, and that's what's being released now. And it's painting a pretty dark picture of people who knew that there was nothing there, that there was no collaboration between President Trump, candidate Trump, Trump's people, and the Russians. And yet they would go happily onto the media and say, oh, these are dark days. Donald Trump is a Manchurian candidate. He's being controlled by Vladimir Putin. And they were lying to us the whole time. And so I think that the significance of this is it's coming out, and it's incontrovertible. It's not, you can't say that, well, there's nothing there. There is something there in their own hands, in their own words. And so I'm looking forward to the day when those people who did abuse power, not just to me, not just to General Flynn, not just to President Trump, but really to the American people. They decided the American people were stupid and that they made a big mistake in 2016. And they were going to save the nation by undermining the Trump presidency and making it impossible for him to govern. Well, they failed. And I think we now have evidence of what they were all about. To me, that's an internal cabal. That's a coup against a duly elected American president.
Leaking classified information to CNN used to get you in trouble. Now it gets you a job at CNN. KT McFarland, thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy day. Best of Fiona, running for Congress down there in Florida. ACU has, of course, endorsed her as the candidate of choice. And, of course, love to the rest of the family. And we hope that you'll join us again very soon, but definitely at CPAC 2021. Right, KT?
You got a date. We are there one way or the other. And I can't wait for it because it will be a vindication of all of the things that you and Dan Schneider and Matt Schlapp and others have been talking about for years. And it turns out, guess what? You were right. You were right about everything. Well done.
We wouldn't be here without you. Thank you for joining us. And right after this quick break, we'll be joined by Mark Trammell. Stick around, folks. We'll be right back.
For the past 100 days, President Trump has been slashing through red tape. He's signed more bills cutting job-killing regulations than any president in American history. He approved the Keystone and Dakota pipelines, opened up offshore drilling. He's put America back on a path to energy independence, and under President Donald Trump, the war on coal is over.
And we're back. Thanks to our friend KT for those important words and helping us get smarter on foreign policy issues and how that deep state operates. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to our CPAC Live audience Mark Trammell. Mark is the executive director and the general counsel of the Center for American Liberty, and colleagues with our pal, Harmeet Dillon, who you are all familiar with. Mark, thanks for joining us this Monday.
Thank you for having me.
Oftentimes we say, what can we do to make a difference, to push back, not just against progressives and the American left. They like to go out and protest, and we ask ourselves these questions. It's a driving question in our thinking every day. What can we do? One of the things that we talk about at CPAC a lot are filing suits. Can we use the legal system to appropriately push back to some of these non-reopen orders, I'll call them, the lockdown orders? You guys over there at your shop have just filed suit against Governor Gavin Newsom, attempting to compel him to reopen the schools. I think the order, but you're the expert on this, the order from Governor Newsom of California is that these schools are going to stay shut for the time being. You'd like to see a different approach. First, tell us about the suit and tell us what you expect to have happen as a result of it.
Absolutely. On the 17th, so about a week and a half ago now, Governor Newsom made an announcement that in, I believe it's 32 counties, it's roughly 80% of the student population in California. To start the fall semester, those school facilities will be closed. And that applies to both public and private schools. So all kids in those areas are going to be distance learners. So this creates a really big problem. We have a situation where, based on one zip code, they may or may not be able to have access to in-person educational instruction. It also raises serious concerns for equal protection. You think about students who are most adversely impacted by this. And across the board, experts continue to say that minority students, students with IEP, so a special needs child, and also students who are learning English as a second language are by far the most adversely impacted by this order. So what we've done is we filed a lawsuit this past Tuesday, and we're standing up for these students. We're representing parents from across the state, and we're raising these issues: equal protection, rights of special needs children, civil rights violations. We're really excited for this suit. I think what we've seen in the other cases that we filed. This is, I think, in the COVID era, maybe the 10th or 11th case we filed against Governor Newsom, representing various clients, whether it's a house of worship or a conservative protester whose protest was denied. And what we've seen across the board in all of these cases is there's always a response. I mean, the governor, I think in this case, has every reason to be concerned. I think there are really strong arguments that we're making against him. But I think we will see some sort of an adjustment. Whether that means he opens schools, we'll see. That's certainly the goal. We want to put choice back in the hands of parents to decide whether to send their kids to an in-person instructional facility, whether it's public or private, or if they want to homeschool. That's their choice. But it shouldn't be Sacramento making that choice. It should be mom and dad.
Do you smell politics behind Governor Newsom's decision to keep the state and schools locked down? Is this a gambit to make sure that his support, anti-Trump support, pro-Democrat, anti-Republican support, make sure that the economy stays as flat as possible up until Election Day? Is any of that going on in your mind with Newsom's calculus?
I don't want to speculate what's going on in the governor's mind, but what I will say is that this action is not grounded in science. The science is very clear that children have virtually no risk of serious injury from COVID-19. Whether you're looking at American studies or international studies, that point has been consistent throughout the scientific community. So it leaves one to pontificate. Why close schools if kids are not at risk for a serious injury from COVID-19?
We read lots of stories about the difficult impact this has on parents' day-to-day lives as they figure out how to earn income. How do you get to an office? If you're a first responder or on the front lines in the medical industry, who's going to be watching your kid? If you're a nurse, a doctor, a cop, or a fireman, you need somebody to watch the kid. But speak to a second for what's happening to the kids. If you lock down a child, any child between the age of 7, a first grader, up until 17 years old, and say, okay, you're going to be stuck at home without any sort of contact. All of your learning will be over the computer. What's that do to a young person's development, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we've heard this narrative over and over. Our phones are ringing off the hook from parents who are concerned about the well-being of their children, and rightfully so. This mandated distance learning started this past semester. And parents got a taste of what that looks like for their kids. And what they saw was very, very minimal actual instruction. What I've heard consistently are that the schools would send or email like a packet of work to do throughout the week. And then students might log in at the end of the week for some sort of an online exam, but there's not that individual instruction taking place. So kids are falling behind. They're falling behind grade level in literacy and mathematics, and it's having an effect. But it also has a social effect on kids too. we can't discount the benefit that schools provide to kids, having that interaction with their peers and learning with their peers and creating those relationships, problem solving, dealing with conflict. And so what it's done is it's placed kids in isolation. So what we're hearing from parents are that their kids are, experiencing anxiety, that their kids are really suffering from this isolation. I actually had a mom who called me the other day, and she said my son, who's in elementary school, he cries in the shower every day. He's just very, very concerned, and it's heartbreaking to hear these stories. But these are real people. These are real injuries that they're suffering. And what is just so upsetting about all of this is there's no scientific justification for it.
Do you think that there are two sets of standards being enforced, saying that kids in school, you can't go to school? Parents are going to have to deal with that. We're going to close down the churches. But if you're in LA and you wish to go exercise your First Amendment right to protest and set the Dolce & Gabbana in Beverly Hills on fire and break the windows, we're not going to enforce the law on that. And that's clearly a gathering over whatever the limit is, 25 or 50. But we're not going to enforce any sort of lockdowns or limits on that constitutionally protected right. Is there a double standard happening over there in California specifically?
Without question. You think about political power here, right? The cannabis dispensaries are allowed to be open. They were declared essential, but a church or a mosque were not. Those are non-essential and had to shut down. You think about Tesla. When Tesla threatened to move to Texas, all of a sudden their factories are exempt. You don't see that same degree of political power in houses of worship or in these private schools, especially these faith-based schools. And so they're still declared non-essential. So they're absolutely, I do believe, is a double standard. Even to your point about the protest, we see people gathering, thousands of people, not social distancing every night in the streets, shoulder to shoulder. Some are wearing masks, most are not. We actually represent, in a case right now at the Ninth Circuit, it's Givens versus Newsom. We represent a pro-Second Amendment advocate who was very, very upset that when this COVID epidemic started, the state stopped processing background checks on firearm purchases. So you could buy a firearm, but you could never take it home. And so he applied for a permit at the state capitol grounds to have a socially distanced protest, and that protest application was denied. But yet we see today, if the protest that you're trying to express is a viewpoint that is agreed by the governor, then that seems to be permissible. But a pro-Second Amendment demonstration is not.
Push back on me if I've got this wrong, but I think I heard you say a moment ago that one of the hopes that you have by filing this suit against the governor is that he'll adjust. What happens legally if he doesn't adjust? Let's say you go, this case goes through, it's seen by a judge, and you guys win. What happens?
Yeah, well, I mean, at that point, if a court says that this is in violation of the Constitution, I mean, the response would be different based on what the court says, right? So if the court says this violates equal protection, I think this goes down to the local level to make a decision on what they do with schools within their district. And so they can have a much more tailored response, right? So if you're in Los Angeles, the COVID infection rate, those numbers are very different from, as you get further from the city. And so, I think they can have a much more tailored response. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is to put choice back in the hands of parents.
A very conservative and constitutionally appropriate approach. We're joined by Mark Trammell, who's the ED and the General Counsel at the Center for American Liberty. Mark, where can we tell our audience to get more information, and how can they track the progress of this important case?
Absolutely. If they go to www.libertycenter.org, you can find a significant amount of information. You can read the pleadings yourself. You can see video, hearing from our plaintiffs themselves. And if folks want to support the case, we would welcome that as well. We have matching gifts available, and you can double your impact today.
This is just it's a very moving undertaking that you guys have decided to move forward with here, really representing the rights and interests of parents and children alike against what's become a state who is just running out of control, it seems like, in a lot of ways. Mark, thanks so much for joining us on this edition of CPAC Live.
Thank you so much.
Before we conclude, first, an item from the Department of Corrections. Our pal Sandy Williamson reached out to me on Twitter after Friday's show, and I feel totally obligated since he exposed a case of anti-New York Yankee bias in my final thoughts on Friday. The fact is that the Yankees and the Washington Nationals took a knee for the national anthem, or just before the national anthem. According to Sandy, they did it all before the anthem is played. This is a moment of protest, and it wasn't just the Yankees; it was both teams as well. It is a distinction with a difference, and we're going to flash Sandy's tweet up on the screen. And you're absolutely right. We should have the facts correct. So I appreciate him. And don't forget, you can reach out to us at CPAC on Twitter to let us know your thoughts if we get anything wrong. We are all human. But first, a few thoughts. We're hitting 100 days before the first Tuesday in November. This is the home stretch, folks, where the battle for the soul of America is going to begin to heat up. That's how politics goes in this nation. And it'll be a very interesting 2020 as these things go. What were the things, thinking about 100 days, what did President Trump accomplish in his first 100 days? On trade, he labeled China a currency manipulator and began the process that KT was talking about getting tough and unpacking some of the mistakes that we made as Americans in the early 2000s with regard to China and shifting some of our manufacturing jobs over there that led to the economic downturn that we experienced in the late 2008, 2009. On climate, President Trump immediately got us out of the Paris climate accords. That was a momentous occasion that helped unshackle the economy so that we could begin enjoying what was the best economy in several generations before COVID America hit. On immigration, finally, we had a president who was willing to understand that the immigration system was broken and needed reform and was willing to address it. Look, the list goes on and on, folks. Think for a moment what would happen if Joe Biden were president. What would he do in his first 100 years? On trade, would he do anything on China? Well, I think his record speaks for itself. He wouldn't do much at all, and he would totally supplicate American greatness to Chinese desire at this point. Just take a look at the voting record. You could go to conservative.org to see where Joe Biden stands on China. On climate, he'd get us right back into that Paris Climate Accord, making sure that your taxpayer dollars would be funding research and development for environmental projects that there's no market or appetite for. Conservatives believe that the market dynamics should determine whether people should buy electric cars or solar panels or not. That shouldn't be taxpayer funded with your hardworking money. And on immigration, I think like most Democrats and with his progressive push to the left, I got a feeling Joe Biden would pretend there's no problem here at the border at all. In fact, maybe we shouldn't even have a border is some of the positions that progressives are pushing these days. So thank goodness we've got President Trump, who appointed a couple pretty solid conservatives to the federal bench in Brett Kavanaugh and Stephen Gorsuch. Think about this for a moment, folks. Under President Joe Biden, who's he going to nominate to the Supreme Court? I know there are so many issues that are not legislated, but decided by the Supreme Court. They shouldn't legislate from the bench, but that are decided by the Supreme Court, especially just in the past few months. We've all been disappointed by the actions of Chief Justice John Roberts. That should remind you how important these issues are. It's issues of life, immigration, Second Amendment, all of those issues important to conservatives. Who will Joe Biden appoint if he's elected president? We'll answer that question on Wednesday when Matt Schlapp returns. He'll be joined by Joni Ernst, a senator from the great state of Iowa, and Scott Perry, a member of Congress from York, and Harrisburg from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Thanks, folks, and join us again Wednesday on Periscope on Twitter, on Facebook Live, here at live.conservative.org, We're on Parler as well, and we'll be back on Wednesday at 3:30 p.m. for another edition of CPAC Live.